Field experiments. Another line of research using observation in natural contexts is directed at exploiting inconspicuous everyday situations to examine the link between certain antecedent conditions and subsequent aggressive responses. Unlike naturalistic observation, where researchers do not interfere with the situation itself, field experiments involve the unobtrusive variation of one or more variables in order to assess their impact on aggressive behavior as the dependent variable. For example, to test the prediction that de-individuation, not being personally identifiable, would lower the threshold for aggression, Rem, Steinleiter, and Lilly, 1987, asked a group of 5th grade students to dress in identical t-shirts for their sports lessons, ostensibly so that a new teacher would find it easier to tell them apart from members of the opposing team who wore their own clothes. The number of aggressive acts during the ensuing handball game was recorded by 2 independent observers who were unaware of the experimental hypotheses. Students who were wearing the uniform t-shirts committed more aggressive acts than students who were wearing their own clothes, supporting the prediction that anonymity increases the likelihood of aggressive behavior. As another example of a field experiment, Barron, 1976, studied behavior in a common traffic situation to test the hypothesis that drivers would show more aggressive behavior when they were frustrated. Frustration, external interference with the goal-directed behavior of the person. Frustration was manipulated by the time that a Confederate took to move his car when the traffic lights turned green. The dependent variable was driver's aggressive behavior, defined in terms of latency and duration of horn honking. In support of his prediction, Barron showed that the drivers, who were unaware that they were taking part in an experimental study, honked faster and longer when the Confederate took longer to move his car. In a different context, a field experiment by Harris, 1974, designed to test the frustration-aggression hypothesis, see Chapter 2, showed that people waiting in a queue responded more aggressively if a Confederate jumped in close to the head of the queue, high frustration, than when he jumped in closer to the end of the queue, low frustration. Despite their advantages in terms of facilitating the analysis of naturally occurring behavior, uncontaminated by social desirability concerns, such field experiments suffer from the problem that many additional variables may operate that are not under the experimenter's control. Suppose, for example, that the queue jumping approach was to be used to study the aggressive responses of people waiting for a bus. There would be a problem if, in some of the trials, the bus for which people were waiting was already 15 minutes late at the time of the experimental intervention, creating an additional and powerful source of frustration that might contaminate the effects of the queue jumping manipulation. In addition, a key feature of experimental research, namely the random allocation of participants to experimental conditions, is often not possible in natural contexts without making people aware that they are part of an experiment. Observing aggressive behavior in the laboratory. The lack of control over third variables that might interfere with the experimental variations and problems with the assignment of respondents to experimental treatments are the main reasons why the vast majority of observational studies on aggressive behavior have been conducted as laboratory experiments. In this setting, situations can be created by the investigator to meet 3 essential criteria. Respondents are exposed to an experimental manipulation aimed at influencing their aggressive response tendencies. They can be randomly assigned to the experimental and control conditions, and many factors which might influence participants' behavior over and above the experimental treatment can be controlled. Experimental studies of aggression need to resort to paradigms in which participants can show behavior intended to harm another person without actually allowing real harm to be inflicted on anyone. Several experimental paradigms have been developed to address this challenge by creating situations in which participants are given the opportunity to deliver a range of different aversive stimuli to another person without actually causing them any harm. Each paradigm uses a somewhat different cover story to disguise the true purpose of the measure. The teacher-learner paradigm. This paradigm uses the setup of an alleged learning experiment in which one person adopts the role of a teacher and presents a word association learning task to another person, the learner. Assignment to the two roles is rigged so that the participant always ends up as the teacher, and the learner is a confederate of the experimenter. In the first round, the participant presents pairs of words to the learner. In the second round, only the first word of each pair is presented, and the learner has to correctly remember the second word of the pair. The teacher is instructed to punish errors made by the learner at a predefined rate through administering aversive stimuli. The participant's choice of punishment intensity represents the measure of aggressive behavior. In the original version of this paradigm, punishments are delivered in the form of electric shocks, the strength of which is determined by the teacher. This procedure, which is probably better known from the famous study of obedience by Stanley Milgram, 1974, than from the context of aggression research, was pioneered by Buss, 1961. He developed an aggression machine that enabled respondents to choose the intensity and the duration of electric shocks, which they thought would be delivered to the learner whenever he made a mistake. No shocks were actually delivered, but respondents received mild shocks in a trial run to convince them that the device was genuine. In later studies, electric shocks were replaced by other aversive stimuli, such as a loud noise, Edgware and Janice, 1994, or air blasts to the throat, Verona and Sullivan, 2008, and the intensity and duration chosen by the participant were used as measures of aggressive behavior. The teacher-learner paradigm provides an experimental framework in which the effects of a variety of independent variables on aggression may be studied. Differences in aggressive responding may be examined, for example, as a function of respondents' group membership, male versus female, prisoners versus students, or situational manipulations, different degrees of frustration or physiological arousal. However, a criticism of the teacher-learner paradigm has been that if they accept the cover story, participants may be motivated by pro-social concerns to help the alleged learner to improve his task performance rather than showing aggressive behavior. In addition, it can only measure proactive, unprovoked aggression, as the learner has no opportunity to retaliate. These problems are addressed, at least to some extent, in other paradigms. Teacher-learner paradigm. Measure of aggressive behavior in the lab, whereby participants in the role of teachers assign aversive stimuli to an alleged learner. Proactive aggression, also called unprovoked aggression, aggressive behavior shown without a prior provocation. The essay evaluation paradigm. In this paradigm, the aggressive behavior consists of delivering negative evaluations of an essay purportedly written by the target person. This paradigm has been used to investigate aggressive behavior in response to preceding frustrations or provocations and was first introduced by Berkowitz, 1962. Participants are told that they are to provide a written solution to a problem-solving task, which will then be evaluated by a fellow participant who is in fact a confederate of the experimenter. They are also informed that the evaluation will be expressed in terms of the number of electric shocks delivered by the evaluator, with 1 shock indicating the best possible and 10 shocks indicating the worst possible evaluation. Irrespective of the quality of their solution, participants then receive either few or many shocks, depending on whether they are in the provocation or control condition. In the second and main phase of the experiment, the roles are reversed, and the participant gets the chance to evaluate the solution provided by the other person. The number of shocks administered indicates the strength of the aggressive response. Typically, more shocks are administered to a target person who is seen as responsible for a negative evaluation of the actor in the first round of the experiment, supporting the hypothesis that provocation leads to aggression. The essay evaluation paradigm has been modified by later studies that replaced electric shocks with other aversive stimuli, such as the level of negative verbal feedback in the assay evaluation, e.g. Crahy and Binek 2012, Vasquez et al. 2005, adapted the paradigm to use feedback about participants' performance on an anagram task rather than an essay. They used the length of time for which participants made the target persons submerge their hands in unpleasantly cold water as a measure of aggression. Beyond addressing the role of anger or provocation, this experimental setup allows researchers to examine additional variables moderating the effects on aggression. A case in point is Berkowitz and LePage's 1967 well-known study on the so-called weapons effect, which will be examined in more detail in Chapter 2. They showed that when participants had been angered, they were more aggressive towards the person who was the source of the anger when an aggression-related cue, such as a revolver, was present, than in the presence of a neutral object, such as a badminton racket. Essay evaluation paradigm. Measure of aggressive behavior in the lab, whereby participants assign negative feedback on an alleged co-participant's essay. The competitive reaction time task, CRTT. Using a different cover story, this widely used paradigm leads participants to believe that they are engaging in a competitive reaction time task against another participant. It is also referred to as the Taylor aggression paradigm, TAP, as it was first introduced by Taylor, 1967. When a visual cue appears on a screen, both participants have to press a button, and the person who presses the button first is the winner of that trial. Before each trial, participants have to set the intensity of the aversive stimulus delivered to the other person in case they win, which represents the measure of aggressive behavior. In the original version, electric shocks were used as aversive stimuli, because success and failure of the naive participants are in fact predetermined by the experimenter. Each genuine participant receives, as well as delivers, a set number of shocks in the course of the task. In order to make sure that participants perceive the shocks to be aversive but not painful, each participant's threshold of unpleasantness is established in a pilot phase. As the task is programmed so that the genuine participants always win the first trial, the intensity they set for the first trial yields a measure of proactive or unprovoked aggression. After the first trial that they lost, and in which they received a shock from their alleged opponent, participants' subsequent intensity levels reflect the strength of their reactive or retaliative aggression. Rather than delivering electric shocks, recent studies have used other aversive stimuli, such as an unpleasantly loud noise, Bartholomew and Anderson, 2002, and measured the intensity and duration chosen by the participant as a measure of aggressive behavior. Yet other studies have replaced the electric shocks with points deducted from an opponent so as to reduce the other person's reward. Stadler et al. 2006. An extension of the CRTT, in which participants are led to believe that they compete against two opponents with different levels of provocation, was developed by Bayer et al. 2017. As noted by Giancola and Parrott 2008, there is ample evidence for the validity of the CRTT, competitive reaction time task, as a measure of aggressive behavior. Several studies have shown that the extent to which participants deliver aversive stimuli was significantly correlated with trait measures of aggression, and also differentiated between individuals with and without a history of violence. In their own study, Giancola and Parrott, 2008, showed that the intensity of electric shocks was more closely related to trait measures of physical aggression than to trait measures of verbal aggression, anger, or hostility, as one would expect from a measure intended to inflict physical harm. A criticism raised about the standard format of the CRTT refers to the absence of a non-aggressive response option. Participants can only choose to deliver more or less aversive shocks or noise blasts. The procedure does not allow them to refrain from delivering aversive stimuli altogether. To address this criticism, modifications have been proposed to include non-aggressive response options. Bushman 2002. Further suggestions for standardizing the procedure of the competitive reaction time task have been proposed by Elson et al. 2014. In a recent comprehensive review, Warburton and Bushman 2019 concluded that the CRTT is a valid and flexible tool for assessing aggressive behavior in the laboratory. In addition, Hyatt et al. 2019 found that different versions of the CRTT yielded similar results, underlining the robustness of this measure. Finally, Chester 2019 presented a multi-level approach that makes it possible to analyze patterns of stability and change in an individual's aggressive behavior over the 25 trials of the CRTT in relation to the aggressive behavior of the real or alleged opponent. Competitive Reaction Time Task, CRTT, measure of aggressive behavior in the lab in which participants assign aversive stimuli to an alleged opponent if they are faster in responding to a signal detection task. Reactive aggression, also called retaliative aggression, aggressive behavior shown in response to a provocation. The hot sauce paradigm. This paradigm for measuring aggression also consists of delivering unpleasant stimuli to a target person. Participants are asked to set the amount of hot, spicy sauce to be consumed by a target person who allegedly dislikes this kind of food. Lieberman et al. 1999. Participants are first made to taste the sauce themselves before being asked to allocate a portion to a person who they believe strongly dislikes spicy food. The selected quantity of sauce is measured and constitutes the measure of aggressive behavior. See Figure 1.1. Using this method, Adjiok et al. 2008 found that participants allocated more hot sauce to a target person who had rejected them as a potential partner in the experiment than to a target person who had chosen them as a partner. Meyer and Heinz 2004 showed that participants allocated more hot sauce to a target person when they were in a group than acting individually, and gave more hot sauce to each target when targets were in a group rather than encountered as individuals. Other studies extended the method by giving their participants a choice of sauces that differed in their degree of hotness. Bartlett et al. 2009. Using a combined index of the hotness of the sauce selected and the quantity assigned to the target person, Bartlett et al. 2009, were able to show that participants who had played a violent video game subsequently showed more aggressive behavior than those who had played a non-violent video game. The hot sauce measure yields an easily quantifiable index of aggressive behavior. Moreover, it is ethically feasible because it does not lead to any harmful effects other than, perhaps, temporary discomfort in the participants as a result of having to test a small quantity of the sauce themselves. Figure 1.1, the hot sauce paradigm. So you can see the scale measuring how much hot sauce and then how spicy it is. Hot sauce paradigm, measure of aggressive behavior in the lab whereby participants assign a certain quantity of aversively hot sauce to an alleged co-participant who does not like spicy food. The tangram help-hurt task. In this recent addition to the toolkit of laboratory measures of aggressive behavior, participants are asked to select tangram puzzles differing in the level of difficulty for another participant. The more difficult puzzles they select, the more they undermine the alleged other participant's chances of completing the puzzle successfully to win a prize, reflecting an intention to harm by which their behavior qualifies as aggressive. Salim et al. 2015. The task also yields a measure of prosocial behavior through the number of easy puzzles assigned to the partner. The task can be modified in the assignment of other tasks of varying difficulty, such as anagrams or number sequences. Tangram help-hurt task, measure of aggressive behavior in the lab, whereby participants assign easy, help, or difficult, hurt, tangram puzzles to a co-participant. Tangram puzzles consist of a set of polygonal pieces that need to be put together without overlap. Each of the paradigms discussed so far uses deception, concealing the true purpose of the experiment, to make participants believe they are harming another person. In addition to obtaining ethical approval for the chosen procedures beforehand, it is important to stress that participants in these experiments have to be carefully debriefed to explain the true purpose of the experiment and to reassure them that they did not inflict any real harm on another person. If these conditions are met, a recent study suggests the ill effects of taking part in laboratory studies on aggressive behavior can be considered minimal, and the paradigms typically used in these studies are safe measures of aggressive behavior. Parrott et al., 2015. The use of behavioral observation is not limited to the assessment of aggressive behavior, but can also be extended to the assessment of anger as an affective antecedent of aggression. This is especially important in studies with young children who are not yet able to provide valid self-reports of anger intensity and anger regulation strategies. Rolfe and Crahy, 2015, developed a paradigm in which children were angered by asking them to build a tower of bricks that kept collapsing because some bricks were rounded at the bottom. See Chapter 3 for a detailed description. Children's maladaptive anger regulation strategies, e.g., venting their anger by throwing the bricks around, were recorded and related to teacher ratings of aggressive behavior. An age-adapted version of the task was developed to study the same children 3 years later. Kirsch et al., 2019.